She stepped out onto her porch one spring day. The smell of the wooden shake over her porch smelled like rain. It had been raining the night before. And she took the 2 steps to the edge of the porch and looked out. And then she looked back to the corner of her stone cottage. And she noticed that the ivy had grown up. And she thought to herself, I need to trim the ivy around the window, or it's going to cover the window and block the sunlight from my living room. A little bluebird landed on the porch rail and looked up at her and chirped. But she took the 2 steps down and started down her stone walkway that went out to the lane. But she wasn't going to the lane today. She did a quick turn to the left and went down a well-worn path. 2 little rabbits hopped along beside her. And she came to a garden. And even though she knew she had a garden unlike any other in the lane, she sighed and thought, just once I'd like to come down here and I'd like to smell the aroma of spring flowers. I'd like to hear the activity of the bumblebees and the honeybees and the birds. Just once, I would like to experience the tremendous splendor of springtime. But as she walked around her garden, it was just about the same size as her cottage. She looked at each one of the bushes, barren skeleton stems, brown and gray. And she circled the garden till she came to a bench that had been once an oak tree. One of her admirers had taken a great oak log and turned it into a bench. And as she backed up to it, a little chipmunk skittered over to the end. And then she swept her dress, her plaid skirt. She swept it forward as she sat down. And she sat like a lady in a royal court. And she held her hands in her lap and waited. And then the sun broke through the clouds and beamed down on this small garden. And as the earth warmed, green began to grow up, all those gray and brown stems. Each bush all of a sudden flourished with leaves. And then when the leaves were all fully grown, blossoms and flowers percolated on the tips of branches throughout. A breeze blew across her shoulder and swept across the garden. And a chatter began. Every plant, with its aroma, its richness, began to chatter. Almost as if on cue, children from the lane started coming across her yard, and they were laughing and giggling and jumping and dancing. And every one of them came down and stood in front of her on the stone patio. And when they all assembled, she looked out and told them, now each one of you go out and touch a blossom, a flower petal, or a leaf. Don't pick it, just touch it. And then come back and sit down. Immediately, all the kids went scattering around her garden. Her garden suddenly became just full of life and laughter. And then once they had touched, they all came back and sat down. And when they had all sat, when the last child sat down, every petal, every leaf, every flower blossom that had been touched rose up and started floating to this delightful lady, as though they were being guided by unseen fairies. The first one to reach her landed on her shoulder and reached up towards her ear, and she bent her head down and listened. And then she shared the story that she heard from that leaf. A brand new story never heard before. And when she finished the story, the leaf rose up on a breeze and floated away. By this time, the kids' parents had made it down to the garden, and also a few adults that had been sitting in front of her not too many years before. And one by one, every leaf and petal that had been touched by a child's hands rose up to her ear. And then she shared the story that they gave to her as the sun swept across the sky. It kept that garden in sunlight all day long. And when the last petal had left, each one with a brand new story never before heard by human ears, and each petal rising up after its story was told and floated away, everybody sat and waited. The kids began to get excited. There was all sorts of chatter among the kids. They knew it was about to happen, but it wouldn't happen until it was time, and everybody was getting all excited, and they were sitting there waiting, and they were puckering up their lips in excitement, and everybody was waiting. And then all of a sudden a breeze came from the woods behind the old lady and swept through the bushes. And all the leaves, the petals, the blossoms that were left rose up onto the breeze. There was a great roar of stories and chatter. And all of these leaves swirled around the garden. And the children watched in awe, and not a single one of them reached up to grab. For they had heard their stories. And these were the stories going out to the villages and the farms for those people who couldn't make it to her garden that day. And in seconds, every leaf and blossom had gone off. The children stood, and every one of them came up to that ageless lady and told her, "Thank you." A few of them gave her a kiss on the cheek, and there were lots of warm hugs. And then the lady who was left in the garden, all by herself, even the chipmunk and the rabbits had left, and a tear rolled down her cheek. But it wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of delight and appreciation for this tremendous gift that her garden gave once a year in the spring. And she stood up and walked back around her garden and looked down at all the brown and gray skeletons that were left, and followed a well-worn path back up to her cottage. And as she put her hand on the rail next to the steps, she looked over at the corner of her stone cottage and noticed the ivy growing there, and she thought, I need to trim that ivy back, or it's going to close up the window and I won't get sunlight in my living room anymore. And a bluebird sitting on the porch rail chirped in response. She pulled herself up the 2 steps and walked across to her front door. And as she put her hand on the doorknob and started to turn it, she suddenly turned around, just in time to catch the most glorious sunset, and heard one petal chattering on the breeze. She pushed the door open, went inside, and carefully closed it.